Have you ever put off something so simple that when you finally had to face it, the world around you seemed to collapse all at once? It's curious how something as mundane as scheduling a doctor's appointment can turn into a life milestone. For some people, a routine exam is just that, a formality. But for others, it can be the starting point of a story that changes everything. And in Camilla's case, a 24-year-old young woman living in Los Angeles, the simple act of visiting a gynecologist for the first time ended up revealing an abyss she never imagined existed. An abyss dug by shame, family secrets, and an agreement she never authorized. Why would someone wait so long to do something as essential as a medical consultation? And what can happen when a young woman discovers overnight that she has been turned into a bargaining chip? The answer to the first question lies in something many know well. Shyness can become a prison. For Camilla, the fear of exposing herself, of being judged, or even being touched by a stranger always outweighed the desire to take care of herself. And the second answer is even more painful. Sometimes, the trust we have in those we love most can be betrayed irreparably. That's how, out of the blue, she discovered that her own family had hidden a truth that would change her life forever. That Tuesday morning, Camilla felt strange. It wasn't physical pain, it was more like a weight on her chest, a premonition. She woke up early, had coffee without tasting it, and while arranging the flowers at the small shop where she worked, her mind was elsewhere. Something was wrong. The silence of her parents in recent days, the whispered conversations at night, the avoiding glances. Everything began to make sense when she saw the envelope on the table. It was an eviction notice. The apartment where they had lived for more than a decade was about to be seized by the bank. And then, when she confronted them, the truth she never imagined hearing came out. Her parents had made a deal with an influential businessman in the city. In exchange for paying off all the debts, he wanted only one thing: Camilla. She was left stunned. This was not a metaphor. It wasn't drama. It had really happened. "He just wants a guarantee before the marriage," her father said, his voice nearly fading. "He wants to know if you're a virgin." It hit her like a bomb. Not only was she being offered as part of a contract without her consent, she would also have to undergo an intimate exam to prove something that until then had been part of her private life. Camilla felt disgust, shame, anger. But deep down, she knew that the time had come to face a fear she had carried since adolescence. The appointment she had postponed for years, not by choice, but by imposition. Under a false name and with a broken heart, she scheduled the exam for the next day, never imagining that it would be the day everything would change. The next morning, Camilla left home with her stomach in knots. It was cold, even by Los Angeles standards. The wind seemed sharper than usual, as if every gust wanted to remind her of what she was getting into. She took the subway to Westwood, where the clinic was located, and every station she passed seemed to push her further into a tunnel with no escape. She was using her mother's last name, Ramirez, so as not to be recognized. She didn't want anyone to know, not the doctor, not the receptionists, not even herself if she could choose. Everything about her trembled, not from the cold, but from shame. It was as if she were going to be judged for something she wasn't even sure she wanted to defend. The clinic was sophisticated, completely removed from her reality. Marble on the floor, the scent of lavender in the air, fashion magazines on a glass table that seemed never to have been touched. An elegant receptionist attended her with a rehearsed smile, and Camilla sat down, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. Her fingers gripped the zipper of her purse as if it were a safety rope. When her name was called, she thought about running away. She really did. She looked toward the door, down at the floor, at the shoes of a woman leaving the room with a relieved smile. But she didn't smile. She just got up, in slow motion, as if her body were acting on its own. The doctor opened the door and called in a neutral tone, "Camila Ramirez?" She nodded, voiceless. He seemed younger than she had imagined. Moreno, tall, with a tanned complexion, a serious yet welcoming expression. His white coat contrasted with his firm, almost inquisitive gaze. Camilla didn't know how to react. She felt her face burn. He led her to the examination room and pointed to the upholstered chair. "Please, have a seat." She obeyed, trying to control the trembling in her hands. She could feel sweat trickling down her back. He began asking basic questions: health history, medications, date of the last menstruation. Everything was normal. But when he asked, "Is this your first time here?" she only nodded. She couldn't even speak. The shame was a silent prison. The exam began in a technical, professional manner, but every movement made Camilla shrink inside. The touch, even if gentle and careful, was like an electric shock to her nerves. There was no physical pain, but there was an uneasiness born of years of repression, fear and fantasy. And then, unexpectedly, something changed. When he noticed that she was too tense, he stopped. He lowered his tone. He said, "Are you all right? We can stop if you want." For the first time, someone gave her the power to choose that day, and that broke her. Camilla closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time, she felt that she was there as a person, not as an object. The exam continued, brief and respectful, but inside her, a silent revolution had begun. When it was all over, Camilla got dressed quickly. The silence in the room was strange, heavy, as if the walls had heard more than they should have. The doctor made some notes in her file and, in the end, simply said, "Everything is fine. You're healthy." But what echoed in her mind was the last phrase he said before opening the door. "You were very brave to come." Those words stuck to her skin like a compliment she wasn't sure she deserved. Brave, for being there against her own will, for doing something that should have been a choice, but became an imposition. Even so, that word was a beacon of light in the midst of the chaos her life had become. She left the clinic with her heart racing, not because of the exam itself, but because of what it represented. Outside, the city seemed to go on as usual. Cars honking, people rushing to work, cafes opening. But Camilla walked as if she were floating, as if she had just emerged from a nightmare. Her shoes pinched, the wind tousled her hair, and she didn't care. What had just happened wasn't merely a gynecological exam, it was a rite of passage, even if forced. A boundary crossed. She felt anger about the situation, about her parents, about that businessman who treated her like property. But she also felt something strange emerging within her, a new strength, the beginning of courage. And that, however small, was more than she had the day before. In the following days, the doctor's name wouldn't leave her mind, Dr. Alex Moreno. It was an ordinary name, but now it carried enormous weight for her, not because of the man himself, but for what he represented. He had been the first to look at her with respect amid the absurdity. He didn't know her story. He didn't know that she had been sold, but he had treated her fragility with a delicacy to which she wasn't accustomed, and that moved her deeply. Camilla found herself recalling the consultation, not with desire or fantasy, but with gratitude and shame. Gratitude that he hadn't been like the others. Shame for having stepped into that situation, carrying a secret so enormous that it barely fit within her. Meanwhile, the wedding date was drawing near. The man who had paid off the family's debts had not appeared. Everything was handled through lawyers and indirect messages. Camilla didn't know what he was like. She didn't know his voice, his face, or the real reason behind that demand. She only knew that on Saturday she would have to dress in white and say yes to a stranger. With each passing day, the dress hanging in the closet seemed to grow heavier. She tried to talk to her parents, but they avoided the subject. The atmosphere at home was filled with silence and guilt. No one smiled, no one ate together. It was as if everyone was waiting for the storm to arrive. And inside her, a hurricane had already formed. The day before the wedding, Camilla decided to leave the house without telling anyone. She took the subway and got off in Santa Monica, near the beach. The sky was overcast, the wind cut across her face, but that made her feel alive. She sat on a wooden bench, facing the sea, and stayed there, staring at the horizon as if it could provide an answer. For the first time in a long while, she cried silently. It wasn't just sadness. It was frustration, anger, helplessness. It was the weight of being treated like a negotiable item, of having her very body involved in a contract where she wasn't even allowed to have a say. She wasn't sure how long she sat there. She only realized it when her cell phone buzzed with messages from her mother, asking where she was. She thought about not replying, but in the end, she wrote just, "I'm fine, I'll be back soon." She felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity, as if something inside her had shattered and at the same time begun to reorganize. For the first time, she seriously thought about running away to another city, to vanish, to start over, but she had no money, no support, no one. All she had was fear and a false name on the medical record at a fancy clinic in Westwood. And strangely, that seemed more real than what awaited her at the altar. That night, when she returned home, the tension was palpable. Her mother tried to smile. Her father pretended to read the newspaper, but their red eyes betrayed their guilt. Camilla said nothing. She went straight up to her room, closed the door, and stared at the dress hanging on the hanger. White, long, elegant, as if that were enough to erase all the weight it carried. She sat on the bed and spent hours staring at the ceiling. She didn't sleep. She didn't cry. She just sat there with her mind spinning and her heart heavy. And it was there, in that suffocating silence, that she made the only decision she could make. If she couldn't change what they were doing to her, at least she would face it with her head held high. She wouldn't be a victim, not anymore. Saturday dawned with a blue sky, as if the universe were mocking the impending tragedy. The house was silent, but everything smelled of orange blossom. The car that would take her to the ceremony arrived punctually at 11 a.m. Camilla descended the stairs, with the dress weighing on her shoulders, her face pale and her gaze lost. Her mother adjusted the veil with trembling hands, and her father tried to smile without conviction. Neither of them said a word. When she got into the car, she felt as if she were heading to her own funeral. The driver was courteous, but did not engage in conversation. Their destination was a luxurious house in Beverly Hills, where an intimate ceremony for a few guests would take place, and she had no idea who would be there. She only knew that by the end of that day, her life would change forever. The mansion was breathtaking. One of those places you only see in magazines or movies, with immaculate gardens, white columns, and a fountain that spouted crystal-clear water right in the center of the courtyard. Camilla got out of the car with trembling legs, clutching the bouquet as if it were an anchor. Everything seemed too silent, as if the world were holding its breath. Upon entering the house, she was led directly to a small room where she was told to wait until the ceremony began. Alone there, she paced in circles, listening to the distant sound of classical music coming from another room. She still hadn't seen the man who had paid for her, and as much as one part of her wanted to run away, another was numb. She no longer felt her body, only her soul screamed. When they finally called her to the main hall, Camilla took a deep breath and tried to maintain her composure. Her footsteps seemed to echo on the marble floor, each one heavier than the last. The few people present were standing, watching her with curiosity. Perhaps they knew the story, perhaps not. The improvised altar was decorated with white flowers and a translucent curtain in the background, with sunlight streaming in through the tall windows. And there, with his back turned, stood him. The man who had bought her freedom with money and her dignity with silence. She couldn't make out his face. The veil covered his, and he still hadn't turned around. Everything around her seemed to move in slow motion, the sound of the music, the glances, the beating of her own heart. It was when he turned around that for a second, time stopped. Camilla's eyes froze on his, her mouth went dry, her mind became a jumble. Because he wasn't just any stranger. He was the doctor, the same one who had performed the exam, Dr. Alex Moreno, the only face that had shown her empathy in recent days. The man who, even without knowing her story, had returned a shred of dignity to her. She stood still. She almost tripped over her own feet. And he was equally shocked. His eyes widened, his jaw locked. And what should have been a simple ceremony turned into a silent tension field between two strangers who, suddenly, recognized each other all too well. He murmured her name, softly. Camilla. And she didn't answer. She just looked back at him, her heart exploding in her chest. The priest began the ceremony, oblivious to the electricity between them. Alex seemed conflicted, with a firm posture, yet a lost gaze. She didn't know if he had known who she was before that moment, but judging by his look, it seemed he hadn't. Camilla felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. How could she continue? How could she recite vows in front of someone who had touched her without knowing who she was, and who now discovered that she was the woman he had bought? It was surreal, absurd. But it was reality, and there at that altar, everything impossible had become real. The ceremony went on, but it seemed that no one was really listening to the priest's words, not even him. Camilla's hands were cold as she tried to appear serene while inside she was breaking apart. Alex, next to her, maintained a neutral expression, but his eyes never left hers. It was as if, in that moment, they were trying to communicate without words. Camilla wanted to ask 1,000 things. Had he known from the beginning? Was he part of that agreement? But there was nothing she could do there. The only option was to wait until they were alone. When the priest asked if she accepted the marriage, her voice nearly failed. She replied with a yes, so soft it sounded like a whisper of despair. After leaving the hall, following the vows and the awkward silence of polite applause, they were both taken to a private room. It was there that they would sign the papers. Alex waited until they were alone to say anything. He leaned against one of the walls, arms crossed, his gaze tense. You are the girl from the clinic," he said, more as a statement than a question. Camilla only nodded. Shame burned inside her like fire. "And you are the man who bought my family," she retorted, her voice trembling. For a moment his face changed, as if that had truly struck him. I didn't know it was you. They used another name." Camilla wanted to believe him, but she no longer knew what to trust. Alex slowly walked over to her, as if any misstep could shatter that moment even more. "Camilla, I didn't want it to be this way. They just told me that the girl needed help. I agreed to pay the debt because I always had that romantic idea of starting a real family, something pure, honest. When you came into that office, I felt something, but I never imagined it was you." She looked into his eyes, searching for a trace of sincerity. And there, despite her confusion, she found something unexpected. Remorse. Not theatrical remorse, but genuine, that disarmed her somewhat, even though she was still furious, hurt, with her soul scarred by everything that had happened. She sat on one of the sofas and covered her face with her hands. She needed time to understand, to digest. I feel used, not by you, but by everyone. I postponed my life out of fear, and when I finally did something that should have been mine, it was out of obligation. I didn't want it to be like this. Alex sat next to her, keeping a respectful distance. Then let's do it differently. We don't need to follow that script written by others. We can start over for real if you want. With respect, with calm, from zero. She didn't answer immediately. But in that pause between trauma and doubt, the seed of something new began to sprout. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps a new beginning. The following hours were a blur. They signed the papers, took formal photos, and the reception was brief. Everything had a strange taste of performance. Camilla barely remembered what she ate, what was said, who was there. The only thought that wouldn't leave her mind was, and now? When they finally got into the car, heading toward the new house, an enormous mansion on the outskirts of Los Angeles, she stared out the window, trying to understand what she was feeling. It wasn't love nor acceptance. It was exhaustion, a kind of emotional burnout that had been accumulating for years. In the seat next to her, Alex watched her in silence, without pressing, as if he understood that, no matter how many papers they signed, he still had no place within her. They arrived at the house shortly before sunset. The mansion was beautiful indeed, a place that anyone enchanted would call a dream, but Camilla didn't feel a part of it. The modern architecture, the luxurious furniture, the view of the hills, everything seemed to belong to another reality. Alex showed her around calmly, without touching her, respecting her space. "This is your room. Feel free to stay wherever you like," he said before stepping away. That unexpectedly moved her. She had expected control, demands, pressure. But he was doing the opposite. Respect. It was the first time that day she could breathe without feeling guilt or shame. She entered the room and, alone, collapsed onto the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time, she felt that she still had a choice. Later, he called her to dinner. Nothing formal, just the two of them, sitting at a table too wide for just two people. Camilla didn't talk much, nor did he, but there was a comfortable silence, different from the previous heaviness. After the meal, they stayed in the living room, without television, without cell phones, just with the ambient sound of the city streaming through the open windows. It was then that Alex broke the ice. "Can I tell you something? I grew up thinking that money was the solution to everything. That if I helped someone, that person would become part of my life out of gratitude. But today I see that isn't true. You don't owe me anything, and if you want to leave, I'll respect that." Camilla looked at him, surprised. She had expected to hear everything, except that, and for the first time, she felt something within her start to thaw. She didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him as if examining an old portrait, trying to understand what she was seeing. "I'm not leaving today," she said in a low voice. "But not for you. It's for me. I need to understand what's left of me after all this. I need to discover who I am now." Alex nodded, respecting her answer. And in that moment, seated side by side, yet with an abyss between them, a strange kind of connection emerged. Not love, nor passion, but a spark of something more human, understanding. And that, for Camilla, was more than she had received from anyone up to that point. That night, Camilla couldn't sleep. She lay awake for hours, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, reliving every choice that wasn't hers. She thought about the little girl who was afraid of doctors, who hid behind excuses, who pretended to be in control. And she thought about the woman who was forced to mature in a single day, who faced the world head-on even with her heart in ruins. She was no longer the same. Something within her had changed. Perhaps she couldn't name it yet, but it was as if she had gained a new shell, not to protect herself, but to firmly hold on to what she was, beginning to rebuild her autonomy. The next morning, upon waking, Camilla made a simple but powerful decision. She grabbed a new notebook she found in the room and began to write. She wasn't quite sure what to put there, so she just started with one sentence. This is the story of the girl who one day decided not to run away anymore. As she wrote that, she cried, but it was a different kind of cry. It wasn't pure sadness. It was relief. Relief for having survived, for not having completely given in, for still having a voice. What had begun as a forced marriage was now transforming into something unexpected, a process of self-discovery. She didn't know what the future would hold, or if one day she would love Alex, or anyone else. But in that moment, she knew she was no longer trapped. She was there by choice. In the weeks that followed, Camilla set her own rules for herself. She wouldn't allow herself to be controlled by others anymore. She wouldn't accept silence as an answer. She wouldn't ignore her feelings just to please others. Alex, for his part, surprised her. He didn't try to rush anything. He imposed nothing. He respected every space, every limit. And gradually, she began to see that maybe he too was trying to learn how to be a better person. They started talking more about everything, about childhood, fears, unfulfilled dreams. For the first time in a long while, Camilla began to truly listen to herself. And that changed everything. The pain didn't vanish overnight. But it was no longer an unbearable weight. It became a scar in the process of healing. One day, while they walked together through the mansion's garden, Alex said something that stayed with her. The greatest freedom someone can offer is the right to leave, but sometimes the true choice is to stay. Camilla smiled, a shy but genuine smile. In that moment, she understood that what had begun as a prison was turning into a lesson, not about romantic love, not yet, but about self-love, about rebuilding, about recognizing one's own worth even when everything around tries to convince you otherwise. And that realization was the beginning of her liberation. The sham wedding never exactly turned into a real marriage, but it didn't end in tragedy either. Over time, Camilla and Alex built a respectful partnership based on listening and space. She went back to studying, returned to work, now in something she chose on her own. She found a therapist, something she never imagined having the courage to do, and began to rewrite her own story. Gradually, fear was replaced by strength, shame by understanding, and that gynecological exam, which once represented a wound, became a symbol of turning point. The day everything fell apart was also the day she began to rise. Today, when Camilla looks back, she doesn't romanticize what happened. She doesn't feel pride for what was done to her, but she does feel pride in who she has become. It was on that single, heavy, intense day that she discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is acting even when everything inside you wants to run away. And in that consultation room, with her heart racing and her face burning with shame, she took her first step. Not for love, not for approval, but for herself. And no one can take that away from her. That choice to not run away was what saved her. She still lives with Alex, but no longer as a submissive wife. They are partners, and time is showing whether that can grow beyond friendship or respect. But most importantly, she feels free, not because of where she lives, nor because of the name she bears, but because of the decisions she now makes on her own. Because, after all, what Camilla learned is simple, yet profound. The world may push you to the bottom, but no one can stop you from swimming. And that day, in silence between fear and shame, she dove in. And from then on, she never stopped swimming. Years later, Camilla returned to the same clinic where it all began, not out of obligation but by choice. She sat in the waiting room, now with a different look, a different body, a different soul. She was no longer the scared girl trembling when her name was called. She was a whole woman. When the doctor called her another professional, another story, she smiled. Because there, in that very place where she once felt like property, she was now just herself. No master, no fear, only freedom. Daily quote, "Freedom doesn't begin when you are set free. It begins when you decide to no longer be silent." If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and activate the notification bell. And tell us in the comments, which city are you watching from? Your presence here makes all the difference.